After going through the melee DPS and the range DPS, it is now time to go through the meta tier list of Season 1 of The War Within for tanks. Now, tanks are in a bit of a special situation, because of course we can't just say, let's look at how they did in the raid testing and how their DPS was, and maybe for a more updated result, let's look at the current sims of tanks, because, you know, tanks also do function on a few more things other than just doing damage. So you will have to look more at their current performance of how they have been doing, for example, in Mythic Plus, how popular have they been in Mythic Plus in the beta, as well as a few other things we have held both the range DPS and the melee DPS accountable for, which is how popular could some of the specs in their class be. So if they could have some sort of competition in the same class. Starting with, first in line, Blood Death Knight. So Blood right now is in a bit of a monotone situation because Deathbringer is practically their only viable hero talent at the moment compared to the amount of nerfs Sunlane received, on top of being already kind of clunky rotationally in the way it is implemented, in the way it practically pushes you to use one of your cooldowns, Vampiric Blood, in your rotation, on top of being even further RNG based with the chances of proccing Vampiric Strike on top of even more chances with summoning a Blood Beast, all on RNG and outside of your control. So Deathbringer is much more stable in that regard. It's a very clean and simple 45-second window, 45-second cycle, which is practically going to end up being, you know, once per pull in Mythic Plus. So it's very smooth from a playstyle perspective for Blood. It also lines up and integrates much better with your rotation and helps your rotation as well, especially Exterminate, giving you a couple of freebie Mara Rens every time. Also, it does have the best defensiveness part for you, which is Rune Carved Plates, whenever it's not bugged and actually working. 10% DR for you as Blood. It is very good because this is one of the more dangerous parts of playing Blood, which has often kept it outside of being the meta tank choice because of the amount of damage they take. You know, eventually, once you start getting higher and higher in keys, your HP drops, so common for a Blood DK, will start getting deeper and deeper and deeper and down to almost being a one-shot. And what has saved you a few times was being able to prevent some of these, like by the end of Shadowlands with your very high parry and being able to reduce this amount of one-shots. This can also help you for a Blood Death Knight. Your damage is good. You're not the highest damage dealing tank at the moment, but you're also not anywhere close being the lowest one. And also with the addition of Reaper's Mark, it goes on top of the already myriads of choices you have for cooldowns, you know, for extra power on demand, whether it is for damage or for tankiness, you know, between Dancing Rune Weapon, Vampiric Blood, Rune Tap, Anti-Magic Shell, Bone Storm, Tombstone, Reaper Max itself, Consumption, Abomination Limb, Lichborn, Anti-Magic Zone, Icebound Fortitude. That's like a dozen, you know, it's like a dozen of buttons at your disposal for cooldowns, which makes you the tank with the most amount of practically choices for you when looking for more power, specifically for defensiveness. You have been the most popular tank in Mythic Plus in the beta, together with Prot Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunter. Your one hero talent, although it's just one, is quite strong. You yourself as a baseline are quite strong. You only have to get used a little bit to the nerf, to the change of Deathstrike, removing all of the pool of damage you took in the last 5 seconds after using Deathstrike. So now spamming multiple Deathstrikes in a row will not be nearly as powerful. But beyond that, you are looking very good, even with your added utility, a couple of things like Vestigial Shell for a pseudo-spread anti-magic shell, or even a much easier to take in Mythic Plus, Mass Grip, Gorsphin's Grasp. Your one danger at the moment, your one danger is kind of the trouble of what we mentioned for a few other specs, which is the fact that Frost DK is also doing very well right now, especially in Mythic Plus, so it would put you at sort of a possible competition between another spec in your class for becoming popular and for becoming meta. Now, after them, a spec that doesn't have nearly as much of a competition in its class is Protection Warrior. So Protection Warrior, unlike Blood Death Knight, does have the option to go for Colossus over going for Montaigne. You can play Mythic Plus keys as your Montaigne for higher AoE damage as well, thanks to your BFA-like old days of spamming Thunderclap and doing much more damage now thanks to it becoming Thunderblast and the damage it can do, or a more straightforward version by playing Colossus, nowhere near, of course, the amount of damage of your Thunderclap and a much more empowered revenge damage. So from that regard, as a Prot Warrior, you are better than DK in the variety, in the options of your hero talents. Not nearly as much when it comes to the variety of your talents, especially your spec tree is quite limited in what you can go for in the choices, in the options you can swap in and out. You're quite limited. You also do have another problem being a warrior, that even in your general tree you don't have nearly as much utility. You don't bring nearly as much to Mythic Plus keys, for example. There is also this problem we talked about when looking over the range DPS, this danger of having once again a triple caster DPS comp in Mythic Plus, which goes directly against a Prot Warrior, because Prot Warrior inherently works very well for melee specs, right? Because being a Prot Warrior, you're a warrior, which means you have Battle Shout, which means you work better with melee comps rather than range DPS comps in Mythic Plus. Nevertheless, you have still been performing exceptionally well in Mythic Plus. You have been one of the more popular tanks, as mentioned, together with Blood and with Vengeance. You have gotten quite a few improvements in the War Within, despite not any major ones in your spec tree. One of the cool ones was removing the damage reduction from defensive stance, so now it's a proper 15% DR at all times without having to do less damage while you are in defensive stance. Also, by playing Montaigne, you have some more skill ceiling in Mythic Plus, not only because of the changes to the casters in Mythic Plus is your spell reflection gaining more value by default, but also now your intervene is much more powerful because you are playing with Storm Shield, which can give a very good absorb shield for magical damage, practically on a 30-second window. You don't have, since we talked about Blood DK, you don't have nearly the same amount of huge cooldowns to rotate around. Generally speaking, yours will be on a lower cooldown and or active more often. Things like Shield Block, of course, but also things like Demoralizing Shout or things like Avatar, as well as making sure to rotate your Intervene and your Spell Reflection. Your big cooldowns, like Shield Wall, like Last Stand, it's nowhere near the level of buttons you can press as a Blood DK, but that's because you are the tankiest of tanks right now. In terms of damage taken, in terms of how much damage you are mitigating. As always, we always remind this, the most important damage you take in Mythic Plus, the most consistent damage you take for a tank is melee. It's just the sheer amount of auto attacks you get during trash pulls. So obviously you having at your disposal what seems very poor here, you're like, hey, look at this Prot Warrior having only 385,000 HPS, while this Blood DK has only 1.5 million HPS. Well, that's because you as a tank do block a lot of damage. You can have a much smoother damage intake thanks to the power of Shield Block compared to other tanks. Of course, that also ends up being your weakness, though. Your weakness that when you do have very heavy damage that cannot be blocked, so you have to fully rely on your Ignore Pain, for example, to prevent that damage, like for example dots. That is where you are much weaker at and much more in danger at dying as a tank. Also worth mentioning that after the buffs received, and also specifically Colossus is doing decent damage, but Montaigne, of course, thanks to their AoE power, is doing very good damage right now as well, so lacking damage wouldn't be a problem, definitely, as a Prot Warrior. And you might also have a slightly easier time, as mentioned, when talking about competition in your same class, because Frost DK is definitely doing better than both Fury and Arms. So you might have more window to be popular, perhaps in the raid, for example. You might not have a DPS warrior in your raid, giving you a free comfy spot as a raid tank, for example, which is something that might be less common when talking about Blood. But together, as a whole, right now, you are looking quite good. Talking about looking quite good, which might come as a surprise actually, is Guardian Druid. So Guardian Druid right now, also renamed for the occasion the Arcano Bear, is doing very well in Mythic Plus, predominantly while playing as Eluna's Chosen, so the whole arcane focused flavor of a Guardian Druid. Of course, as a result, a lot of your damage will come from your arcane flavored abilities. You can still, after multiple attempts at buffing Druid of the Claw, you can still play with it, but definitely the popular choice for the moment is Eluna's Chosen. You were a reasonably popular tank as well in Mythic Plus, not to the level of Prot and Blood, but still quite an option. Now, one of the good things about Guardian Druid is that you do have the choice. This is something that will be quite important for tanks, which is the choice of going full all-in in your incarnation and your power of your incarnation together with Astral Insight as well from your Eluna's Chosen hero talent, or to go for a more consistent style, get rid of incarnation, switch over to Light of Elune, and for less power in your cooldown, in your big cooldown, and more consistent power. This is very relevant because this is always what is going to end up shaping Mythic Plus. Usually, although there is some doubts about this season of the War Within because of the danger of the trash mobs, because of how dangerous their casts are going to be, and how much more difficult it is going to be to interrupt these casts, since now any other crowd control that isn't an actual interrupt won't put many of the spells on cooldown, so the casters will just go back to casting again as soon as they are out of their crowd control, meaning that mega pull big packs together might be more difficult to pull off. But if that were the case, then you have to start looking at the Mythic Plus from the angle of, okay, who's got the strongest 2-minute cooldowns, the strongest 3-minute cooldowns? How can we line up our route in Mythic Plus to make sure that we can hit 2-minute or 3-minute cooldowns around big pools to maximize the power of the specs we have? This has happened multiple times throughout the seasons, whether it was Vengeance and Metamorphosis, or whether it was Guardian with Incarnation, as well as lining up other cooldowns, for example, Breath of Eons together with Combustion, together with Power Infusion, right? That is usually how sometimes the meta gets shaped. So Guardian is in a good spot right now, because if we continue down the line of what it looks like from the beta of the War Within, where it's going to be much harder to go for powerful cooldowns and huge pools because the danger of the trash mobs will make it much harder, then Guardian Druid can sort of downscale these powerful cooldown, or altogether not take it and go somewhere else, opting, for example, for more consistent damage and more shorter cooldowns rather than going for the big cooldowns if you go into a meta of, big, huge pools and massive cooldowns being required. This is a luxury that some other tanks cannot do. For example, Prot Warrior doesn't have this luxury. They are constantly on this cycle of activating their avatar and their empowered thunderclaps. When they play Mountain, Blood DK doesn't really have this option. They play Deathbringer and they have this 45-second cycle. Guardian Druid can choose, which could be a pretty good plus as a tank in Mythic Plus. Now their damage is, again, okay. We are in a season right now where almost all of the tank's damage is looking pretty okay, pretty good, nothing like particularly standing out as weak. But there is then also a further option, a further plus for Guardian, which makes them possibly even more valuable, which is, at the moment, the state of Feral Druid, but more importantly, the state of Balanced Druid, not being good. Their real only contender in their class would be Resto Druid, which even then isn't the clear-cut #1 choice for Mythic Plus, and even less for the raid. So you do have more value in bringing a Guardian Druid, even more so perhaps in the raid, where at the moment you don't have that many reasons to bring a Feral or a Balanced Druid, and you have plenty more options to find a good comp of healers without a Resto Druid, which would put you in a pretty good spot as a Guardian Druid for finding a spot as a tank in the raid. So right now it is looking quite good for Guardian Druid, despite still all of its problems, right? Yes, their general talent tree is still terrible. Yes, their rotation is still reasonably brain dead. It doesn't really change much even if you change to Eluna's Chosen and you turn into an Arcano Bear or not, you are still pressing like 3 buttons. So it does still have these problems, but from a power perspective, they are looking quite good. Talking about looking quite good from a power perspective, you have Vengeance Demon Hunter. So Vengeance is the best at the moment in the viability of its hero talents. Blood DK practically has none. Guardian Druid has few when it comes to Mythic Plus, but it can play with Druid of the Claw more in single target and in the raid. Protection Warrior was the best one at having 2 viable hero talents, and then now you have Vengeance, which can definitely play with both. However, after the many buffs given to Felskard, especially when it comes to AoE, it is now basically the default choice when it comes to going in Mythic Plus. Eventually, after the several amount of buffs given to Demon Surge, to the explosion damage, even after Burning Blades being nerfed, it is now the default choice when it comes to Mythic Plus for Vengeance. It's also the easier, the smoother to pull off compared to Eldrazi Reaver. One of the big powers we just talked about when talking about what the meta is going to be in Mythic Plus, for example, being whether or not it's about big cooldowns or about more consistent pulls. Vengeance is a bit more lopsided. It's funny that in the S tier we have practically 2 opposites. Blood DK is much more consistent in its pulls, centered around Deathbringer and 45-second windows and very short cooldowns to use, pull after pull after pull. Vengeance is much more lopsided, especially if you're playing as Felskard, because Felskard puts all of its power in Metamorphosis. And while sure, you do have a bit of that Metamorphosis when you use Fel Devastation because of Demonic, your biggest power is in the big cooldown itself, in Metamorphosis itself, because that's what Felskard and all of the talents around Felskard, from the Demon Surge explosions, from activating Metamorphosis, resetting your cooldowns of Sigil of Flame and Fel Devastation, and the stacking damage of your Demon Surge the longer you are in Metamorphosis. It does play really well along what we mentioned for Guardian and their possible big pulls around Incarnation, for example. For them, for Vengeance, it would be the same with Felskard around Metamorphosis. Their damage is high. Since we have mentioned for a while most of the tank's damage being okay to good, they have one of the higher damages in Mythic Plus as a tank. They are still pretty tanky, despite having some, blood DK moments where they might drop low. They actually do have quite consistent damage reduction in Mythic Plus, with a mix of avoidance from their general talents to things like when you do play with Illuminated Sigils with a very high parry chance, as well as your natural dodge as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, as well as your frequent usage of cooldowns. Now, again, you're not just quite a Blood Death Knight in the amount of cooldowns you're using. Your case is similar to the ones of a Prot Warrior, in the sense that you have your active mitigation plus Immolation Aura plus your Fel Devastation, your Fiery Brand, that all need to be sort of chained together or overlapped together to give you that high level of tankiness, compared to a Blood DK just using bigger cooldowns and more of them. You are more of the short and quick type rather than the big and long of a Blood DK. Talking about popularity, also needs to be mentioned, Havoc Demon Hunter is doing quite well right now, so you might have some decent competition in terms of power, but at the moment it does look like you would be pulling ahead of a Havoc Demon Hunter especially in your Mythic Plus compositions. And that's where we have to go back to talk about the difference with Prot Warrior, where Prot Warrior brings Battle Shout and favors melee comps. Well, obviously Vengeance is going to be the opposite, bringing magical damage debuff to your party or your raid. It does favor caster comps, and we would know something about this because the last time Vengeance was popular, caster comps were being favored. So there is also a risk that, seeing Vengeance Demon Hunter being the meta tank, it would naturally advantage the casters, especially in Mythic Plus. Now, talking about favoring, something that isn't really being favored right now is Protection Paladin. So Protection Paladin does have a few issues, in the personal opinion of myself, my staff, and all of the respectable pundits. Protection was the one that was hurt the most when it came to the tank changes, tank rework brought by Blizzard for this first season of The War Within. The changes given to the tanks, the extending of your max HP, your health, getting to 8, 9, 10 million HP, but not buffing some of your defensives, in particular the ones scaling with attack power, so not based on your health or on a percentage of your health, have hurt Prot Paladin quite a bit. Also, the nerfing of all of their cooldowns has hurt Prot Paladin by quite a bit as well, especially Righteous Protector. Reducing the cooldown of your wings and your guardian is quite hurtful. The Eye of Tyr, now lasting for only 6 seconds, was also quite hurtful for a Prot Paladin, which was already bad in and of itself. Then you have an even better thing, which is the dysfunctional hero talents. At the moment you are forced into Lightsmith, not really because Lightsmith is OP, like it might be for some other specs even within the same Paladin like Herald of the Sun, but simply because Templar is just too badly tuned for Protection Paladin. It does do very weird things, like for example replacing an actual defensive with proccing your entire Templar ability, Light's Guidance, working off of Eye of Tyr. On top of that, the maximum power you can get with this hero talent is if you do line up your Eye of Tyr to proc Hammer of Light inside of your Sentinel, which again is something you want to use defensively as a Paladin and not simply to proc a hero talent whenever you want to. And lastly, even worse, the same problem that will stay in Lightsmith, which is having many talents that synergize with Holy Power Generator abilities, like Crusader Strike, Hammer of Wrath, and Judgment. This is all good and nice when you're playing a spec that does function a lot with generator abilities. The problem is that Prot Paladin is hurt by these things ever since Blizzard removed the Holy Power generation from your Avenger's Shield, because now Blessing of the Forge to get your summoned weapons, casting spells whenever you use Holy Power abilities, that is completely null and void when you're just casting Avenger's Shield, because now it doesn't give you Holy Power anymore. So even while playing Lightsmith, it's not that you're playing Lightsmith while you're happy as a Prot Paladin. Then the change to tanks has left you reasonably weak and hurt compared to some of the other tanks' changes. And on top of that, your damage is quite low. Yeah, we just said most of the tanks were okay in damage. If there was one that was quite high, was Vengeance. If there is one that is quite low, is Protection Paladin at the moment. That is just how Prot Paladin has felt so far in the beta. They were the least played tank in Mythic Plus by a big margin. The change to tanks has hurt them the most. The hero talents are not particularly exciting and they don't seem to understand what do you want to play around very often as a Prot Paladin, as well as weakening your bread and butter cooldowns, in particular Eye of Tyr. And to make everything worse, one of the better healers for now in Mythic Plus does also seem to be Holy Paladin, to make them even less of a likable option. That's the current not too positive overview when talking about Prot Paladin. Last in line, at a pretty average and anonymous result, is going to be Brewmaster Monk. Now, Brewmaster Monk, chilling at the moment mostly around Shadowpan, more so than Master of Harmony. It is a hero talent that works very well for Brewmaster. The cycling around the damage you do, which would scale very well, of course, with bigger pools in Mythic Plus, doing more damage and proccing more flurry charges. Between being able to give you stacking agility, upwards of 20% based on your procs of flurry strikes, plus the cooldown reduction you can get from Weapons of Order with efficient training, as well as somewhat similar to Blood Decay's 10% permanent damage reduction. This is practically also a permanent damage reduction for Brewmaster Monk when playing Shadowpan, and then the final buff of Wisdom of the Wall. What this does is that, number one, it continues the tradition of Brewmaster Monk having the practically highest damage as a tank, and this is continuing in the War Within as well. However, other things are continuing as Brewmaster Monk, which is your problems of self-healing. You are the most healer-reliant tank right now. Even a Protection Warrior is arguably going to do a better job at keeping himself alive. You are also still one of the harder of the tanks to play, because we are making a tier list about how powerful they are, but you also have to consider the difficulty of some of these tanks. For example, Guardian is significantly more easier to pull off than a spec like Vengeance, even if Vengeance is currently performing better. And simultaneously, Protection Paladin, due to the nerf of their big cooldowns in particular, has to navigate using those cooldowns properly with way more care than, for example, a Blood Decay who has 25 different cooldowns to press. Same goes for Brewmaster. Brewmaster does have a list of buttons you have to press and the knowledge you have to have about your own stagger and purifying and cleaning up your own stagger that requires a bit more knowledge than your average tank, let's call it that way. And making a mistake with a Brewmaster can be very often way more hurtful than some of these other tanks. In the case of Brewmaster, perhaps it is because they haven't changed nearly as much that they don't get to look nearly as promising, because we do have some changes for Blood, especially coming from their hero talents and the base power they already had, even though after the nerf to Vengeance, their new hero talents and some of the streamlining of their talents themselves, on a similar note to what happened to Protection Warrior, Guardian Druid as well through Eluna's Chosen, and the changing on quite a few of their arcane synergizing talents have been quite positive, whereas for Brewmaster is not nearly as much. They seem to be more of the same. Even if Shadowpan is looking good, it is still ultimately completely passive. Ultimately, Flurry Strikes simply procs by itself based on how much damage you're doing, and it continues to proc by itself, and even Wisdom of the Wall also procs by itself. You don't practically have to think when piloting this hero talent. And lastly, we can finish with at least a positive for Brewmaster, which is the power of their other specs. Windwalker at the moment is not particularly lined up to be a premier S-tier spec in Mythic Plus or in the raid, and Mistweaver isn't either. So if we were looking at the positive there, then Brewmaster does have a pretty smooth amount of room to navigate when talking about the popularity of the specs in the class. It is arguably the one in the better spot compared to all of the other tanks, because Blood has Frost, which is very good, Vengeance has Havoc, which is good, Protection has Fury, which is good, Guardian has Restoration Druid, which is very good, and then Prot Paladin has Holy Paladin, which is also very good. Not nearly as much the same case for Brewmaster Monk. So that is what would pin this Brewmaster Monk in this position right now. Quite similar to the last expansion, not too many major changes to the spec, and the spec before wasn't doing particularly well or wasn't being, particularly meta for practically the entire expansion. But they do have the positive of possibly having a nice spot, especially in the raid, if Mistweaver and Windwalker won't be finding a spot, which isn't that unlikely at the moment for Brewmaster Monk. So this is the current situation for the tanks to be put together next to the situation of the melee DPS as well as the ranged DPS. So with this done, we now only have the healers to go through, just a few days before the early access of the actual expansion. So for today, on this Monday, it is now time to leave each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it looks like it's over. It looks like after yesterday, we are only gonna have cloudy, chilly days in this August, which I don't mind.